Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. In our last show, we covered the final topic in our series on virtues and vices. Let's now reflect on the series as a whole. What are some lessons we can take away? Joining me is Dr. Shabir Ally to help us wrap up our series on virtues and vices. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So as we're reflecting on the series that we did on virtues and vices, why did we do it to begin with?
Well, it's very important that we think about virtues and vices. In our modern world, people tend to think, these things are like outdated. These are like religious principles. Someone can come up, a list of 7 virtues, 7 deadly sins, and so on. But people largely nowadays are moving away from religion. People may have a sense, okay, there is a great spirit or a great power that runs everything, but we go along with our day-to-day lives without the constraints of religion. Sometimes I think that the constraints of religion will keep them back. Sometimes people think that in order to get ahead in business, you have to lie a little bit. Sometimes some Muslims think that in order to have like a successful restaurant, you have to serve alcohol and you cannot get away from this, and so on. So people are compromising their religious principles because they feel that the demands of modern life are such that religion would be too much of a constraint to worry about. So when we think about virtues and vices, they're not thinking generally in those terms. Of course, there are many religious people still out there, and there are people who are not necessarily religious but are quite conscientious, and they want to be good and noble and do all of the right things, and they want to avoid things which are unethical and lacking propriety and so on. So it is important that we, in a show like this, refocus the attention of the nation to things which are ultimately more important than money and wealth and success in business and in career.
And I think in some ways we also sort of humanize these virtues and vices, right? As opposed to being big golden principles that you sort of just hear about. I think we gave practical examples on how to implement them.
Yes, and I would like to add here that there's not necessarily a dichotomy between pursuing virtues and avoiding vices on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to be successful career-wise and business-wise. In fact, the two can be welded together, or melded, if I use a term that I heard from that movie Pacific Rim. Bringing the two together actually can help a person to be more successful, both in one's career and also in one's business. And that is a success which, in the end, a person will be happy to live with. So how could truthfulness help a person to be more successful career-wise, for example? It often happens that truthful people are sought out and given promotions because they can be trusted. And so in many different ways, practicing virtues and avoiding vices can actually help a person to get ahead. And some vices obviously bring people down, bring people with massive careers and people who are highly successful, sometimes because of their uncontrollable vices, end up depraved and in shame. They become a source of embarrassment, a liability rather than an asset for the people around them and the corporations or sometimes the cities that they represent.
I think the Ashley Madison hack was a good example of sort of, we discussed that on a separate show, but sort of helped illustrate how, acting on a vice, perhaps, for instance, can really impact an entire community and a business.
Yes, and of course we have had a past mayor in Toronto who, because of some of his vices, became an embarrassment to the city. So it's very important then that we think about these virtues and try to implement them in our lives. And also we become aware of the vices if we're not aware of them already, and we do our best to, better than we've done before, to avoid them.
For you, which one was your favorite topic to discuss?
Well, I like to discuss the problem of moderation and extremism. Well, the problem of extremism and the solution for that being moderation. Not because this is more important than the others, but because this is so all-pervasive in many things that we do, and because of its modern relevance. Now extremism is a major problem for Muslims. Some of our youth are taking Islam in an extreme manner, and that means that it's a deviation from what Islam really should be, because Islam is meant to be a moderate religion, and many misunderstand that. So I like the fact that we were able to bring that in to within that the parameters of virtues and vices and deal with it thoroughly.
Now, what advice would you have to some people who obviously saw our show and maybe are truly trying to implement a virtue, but the vices are sort of more predominant in society? And I'll just go on the example that you mentioned earlier about someone trying to advance in their career. One example might be if you're working in the public sphere, people go out to drinks, for example. How do you battle with that? Do you sort of go along with the flow, or do you completely segregate yourself, but then that impacts your career? Another example might be you're trying to practice, fix up your language and use cleaner language, but you're in an environment where people use swear words as it's an everyday language. So how do you practically try to implement what we discussed?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the first case with going out for drinks and so on, obviously if that's the objective, like guys are going out for a drink, then the Muslim guy in the office has to say, sorry, that's contrary to my religion, and you guys go out and do what you have to do, but in the meantime I'll spend my time maybe doing some more work, or governing my personal time in a way that I feel would be more beneficial to me.
Or maybe even asking for accommodations, right? Or if we can go to a place doesn't just serve alcohol, but it's more inclusive.
Well, I mean, if it's a drinking party, then obviously it will be rubbed very heavily on the conscience of the Muslim in this case. But let's say there was a company dinner or a luncheon, especially if it has a sort of business flavor, and then some drinks will be served at the same time. Now, traditionally, Muslims were prohibited from sitting at a table at which alcohol is being served. But in a case like this, one can see what is the extent of this prohibition, what is the spirit behind it, and so on. And if the Muslim is able to, if the Muslim is confident that I can go there and sit and be part of that business meeting and not partake of any of the alcohol, then maybe that's what would be appropriate for that circumstance. Not that it's very desirable, but there's a scale of things, from being on the one hand totally haram and being on the other hand totally permissible, or rather to be on the other hand obligatory, and probably I should put the obligatory on my right,
Yeah.
Obligatory on the one extent and haram or prohibited on the other extent. And in the middle there are things which are neutral. They're called mubah in Arabic, indifferent, neither there nor here. Now, as we approach the haram side, some things are very haram and some things are, haram, but still, I mean, under that same category, but within that category of haram, some things are terrible and some things are not so terrible, right? Somebody made a joke about this, saying dancing is haram, pigs are haram, so dancing pigs must be very haram. Of course, I don't take the view that dancing is haram, but the point here is that some things within that haram category are more terrible than other things. And some things are close to the haram category, but not quite there. That's why the scholars give it titles such as makruh, which means like objectionable or disliked, but not haram. It's still a bad thing, but not so bad as haram. So one has to see the circumstances, because the circumstances sometimes show whether the thing is of that terrible nature. So drinking alcohol, this is haram for the Muslim. Sitting with the person who's drinking the alcohol, this now is questionable. It is makruh. It is something the Muslim should not like to do. But you might accommodate that for a certain reason, because maybe the haram is uncompromisable, but the makruh disliked, maybe disliked in one circumstance and not so disliked in another circumstance. Or you might see that to avoid that disliked thing might plunge you into something that is more undesirable. And for example, a Muslim is at work and you're part of the team and the team is going out for a lunch. Yes, you can ask for some accommodations, you can ask people to consider the fact that you don't really like this, but you still show the willingness to go along if that's the team spirit and that's what is finally decided. You don't want to be excluded from something that is important to the team, especially if some business will be discussed at the meeting.
And this is where I guess our virtues and vices that we discussed come into play, right? Being honest, promoting the message of peace either which way, no matter what circumstance you're in.
Exactly, and the practice of moderation as well. Like, one should not be so strict as to say, no, absolutely, I cannot do anything of that nature or something like this. One has to see the nature of the circumstance, the nature of the prohibition itself. Is it absolutely prohibited? And it is important in all of these circumstances to be aware of our obligations towards God in the first place, and towards human beings as well.
If there's one message you have for our viewers, what would it be?
Well, I wish we had more time to discuss more of these, and we could have tackled truth and falsehood in a more targeted manner. We mentioned it in passing, but to me, this is one of the most important virtues that people should inculcate: truthfulness. We talked about it under sincerity, perhaps, or under the control of the tongue, speaking the truth, avoiding falsehood, being sincere, avoiding hypocrisy. I think this truthfulness is one of the most important characteristics of a Muslim. And if one is truthful, one would avoid many sins, because if you are about to commit a sin, you'll be thinking, man, what am I going to tell my wife? What am I going to tell my son? What am I going to tell my daughter? What am I going to tell my friends? And usually one has to come up with some lie to hide the fact that he or she has committed a sin. So if you realize that if your principle is that you'll never tell a lie, then you hesitate to commit a sin, because you know that you will have to lie to cover it up, and your principle is not to tell a lie.
I know I personally learned a lot from this series in terms of, practically implementing some of the virtues and recognizing the vices. So thank you so much, Dr. Shabir.
Quite welcome.